Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So, good afternoon and thank you. Thanks to Merin Simiraj and Robin Andrews for convening the second International Conference on Anglo-Indian Studies, and to Merin and her team on the ground, Shruti and others from the IT department, and IIT Madras, especially the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, the New Zealand India Research Institute, and of course, Anglo Inc. And to all of you, presenters and participants, for coming out for this. As Beatrix D'Souza, who sadly is not here with us, as she described it on Facebook, this is an intellectual feast for us. More than ever, conferences on these topics are needed now. In the current context in India and many other parts of the world, the push against minorities is ever present. In the bastions of democracies, we are being exposed to the fragility and brittleness of the promise and expectation of rights. And we are being informed that there are those who deserve and qualify for rights, and that there are those who don't. In some ways, this makes our work of engagement with what is essentially a minority studies project, Anglo-Indian studies, it makes our engagement simpler and more obvious to others, but in other ways, it's more complex. We need to get to nuance and detail. We need to remain aware of heterogeneity and homogeneity. My presentation this afternoon is a modest, and I say modest first because the project I'm talking about is huge and needs the work and input of many and time to develop and mature, and the thoughts I will share are just a small part of it. But it's modest also because I will share with you the strategies that I have utilized, knowing humbly and fully well that there are many practitioners in this room who are much more seasoned with some of these strategies. Modest also because for me, this is still new in many ways. I am flying a trial balloon, and you are the first I am sharing this with. And finally, modest, because in trying to identify what is currently already there, what needs to be done, and to indicate paths that could be followed, it needs much more time than we have today. There is a lot that remains unsaid, and some things are only just touched upon, to give more of a taste than a detailed, teased-out position and explanation. This is definitely not an exhaustive presentation, it's just a start. So to continue, my presentation this afternoon is a modest contribution to the emerging, yet growing and exciting field of Anglo-Indian studies from a methodological standpoint. Finally, we are an eclectic group gathered together in this conference, and while some of us may be very familiar with some or all of what I will say, others may not. So in the interest of clarity and comprehension and equity, please be indulgent and not impatient with me. In Anglo-Indian studies, from a handful of key works that continue to be cited and referenced, we are now at a time of growth in the field. While this expansion is very welcome, we need to be ever alert and that we are not just replicating and repeating, albeit with fresh evidence, replicating and repeating examples and case histories of what has gone before. The time has come when, in order to contribute to the development of Anglo-Indian studies, we need to more consciously identify relevant methodologies as well as tailor-make methodologies that are appropriate for our times and research agendas. Earlier paradigms utilized in work on Anglo-Indians has focused on marginalization and identity. How relevant are they today? Anglo-Indian studies scholar Robin Andrews' work demonstrates that today it would be inaccurate to talk about an identity crisis among Anglo-Indians. And in the context of the current state of the nation and the world, enforced marginalization is clearly not something that only Anglo-Indians have to contend with in minority-majority discourses and policies and practices. In this historic moment, minoritarian identities and political marginalization puts many others, others with a capital O, puts many others in the same boat, literally often, so to speak. There is collective marginalization of people who are victimized by various stripes of national identity politics. So earlier essentializing canards that seem to dog Anglo-Indians in particular ways are now also visible with respect to other communities. What I propose are various ways forward, some that build on existing pertinent methodologies, hence the Khichuris and Kedgiris in the title, but I also suggest some bespoke methodologies that are unique to the Anglo-Indian experience. At this point, I need to say that I am reassured that some of this work is already in place and has been happening. There are many, including in this room, who are very familiar with the use and application of some of the methodologies that I will touch on in their work as literary scholars, anthropologists, sociologists, and historians, to name just a few disciplines in which there's been recent work on Anglo-Indians. Robin's life story and narrative and ethnographic methodologies, Brian Pepin's deconstruction of ubiquitous literary tropes, Harry McClure's chronicles, Uther Charlton Stevens' work with primary sources, to name a few, and the work of many others, including other newer and younger scholars. And with the internet and digitizing, some things are easier, but also a cautionary note, can still be ephemeral, Cecilia, literally here today and gone tomorrow. Toni Morrison's words are an apt reminder of some of what is involved in the task at hand. She warned, "Scholarship that explores the mind, imagination, and behavior of slaves is precious, but just as valuable is a serious intellectual effort to see what racial ideology does to the mind, imagination, and attitude of the masters. That is, how hegemonizers are impacted by the hegemonic ideologies and practices." And James Baldwin's wonderful reminder of our human possibilities. "I am what time, circumstance, history have made of me, certainly, but I am also so much more than that. So are we all." My positionality in all this is as an Anglo-Indian woman who was born and raised in India, but who for two-thirds of my life has lived in the diaspora, who, like many of my generation, have faced discrimination and inequality as a consequence of my multiple identities and spatial locations: woman, Anglo-Indian, part Chinese, Indian/South Asian, Anglophone in Francophone Quebec in Canada, of color. Being Anglo-Indian in the diaspora has its own peculiarities. In Canada, there's an umbrella identity, South Asian, and within it, Indian South Asian. And from among this group, not infrequently, will I hear, "But your name isn't Indian," even as the speaker may be quick to claim to be as Canadian as anyone else in a country with a stated ideology of multiculturalism. So depending on my frame of mind, irritable, open to teasing, sarcastic, I may respond didactically, "India is also a multicultural country, you know." And from majoritarian white English speakers, "You speak English so well, British accent, etc." However, in the diaspora, among some folk of South origin, we work well together without a thought to roots and origin: Indians, Pakistanis, various religions, or no religion. So depending on circumstance, I can pass for Indian and for non-Indian. When looking at discrimination and inequality, we can discern the subtle difference in language. But in terms of lived reality, the two are very different. Discrimination is harder to pinpoint and therefore to confront. Inequality can be more tangible and therefore possibly statistically provable. But when I think back to my earlier research choices and the feeling, unspoken but internalized, of topics that were serious or non-serious, and how I started out working on Hindu women in Bengal before coming to Anglo-Indian women, and this is not to say that all Anglo-Indians should only work on Anglo-Indians, and I talked about this briefly in my presentation at the conference last year here. But when I think back to my earlier choices, the subtleties that impinge because of lived realities become all too real. This is an exciting time when we are drawing on some of the pioneering work that has gone before, including by some in this room, pioneering work that has challenged various status quos, gender, colonial, national. So in some ways it is easier, but in others it can still be tough at a personal level. In special ways for insiders, because we are putting ourselves out there and making ourselves vulnerable. What might work for an earlier period mayn't work for the contemporary. Situation, moving, shifting, not static, but earlier tropes get trundled out and redressed in new costumes to fit contemporary moments and political agendas and priorities. So the task at hand is to enable ourselves to distinguish and to challenge, but not get overwhelmed and duped, caught in a time warp, or simply apply past paradigms to the present. Methodology is a system of methods used in a particular area of study or activity, and method and methodology can be disciplinary specific, literary, anthropological, historical, economics, etc. Comparative methodologies and studies are also very useful. Methodologies assist in making sense, challenging, building, and creating, and in so doing, help to construct theory and epistemologies theories of knowledge, especially with regard to methods, validity, and scope, and distinctions between justified belief and opinion. In our project, we have been and are engaged in challenging established positions and views. More than a rehabilitatory project, Anglo-Indian Studies, even as it seeks to bring understanding and clarity, is a liberatory project. And as such, it engages with power, established power and constructs, dissembling them and identifying and creating new and meaningful methods and theories to build meaningful and liberating knowledge. When I speak to my students as they work on their research projects, when I speak to them about bias and subjectivity, I emphasize that it's not a bad thing to come to a conclusion and have a view or position. Often there is this fear that's been inculcated in research methods classes they have taken to beware of subjectivity and bias, to be balanced, but it often takes them to a place of an intellectual paralysis of sorts, and more importantly, a blindness to the reality that not taking a position can in itself be a position. As the American historian Howard Zinn said, you can't be neutral on a moving train. Not taking a position is siding with the status quo, with entrenched power that has the tools and capacity and wherewithal to construct knowledge and to impose and entrench that knowledge as the truth. So to my students, I say, go with the evidence, engage in critical reading with a consciousness of power, an awareness of power imbalances and hegemonic paradigms. And this is something that is definitely needed in Anglo-Indian studies. A few years ago, the late brilliant Saba Mahmood, in her reply to Judith Butler, wrote, I am open to accepting Butler's argument that critique requires the shifting of normative assumptions that structure the possibility of knowledge. But I am always struck by the fact that academics are seldom moved to abandon their normative evaluative frameworks, read status quo and hegemonic here, despite training and exposure to this kind of thought. With this, Mahmood invites us to grasp what may be labeled defensive reactions and mold them into articulate and counter-hegemonic arguments. We need to be brave, we need to be bold. We feel anger, we must harness it. For insiders in Anglo-Indian studies, this means we must decolonize ourselves, or if we've already started to do so, to continue and not to stop. For outsiders in Anglo-Indian studies, it is about constantly being aware of your privilege and positionality as you work in the field. And I will say something more about this soon, about allyship. After all, methodology is political. It emerges from an established place that consciously, or more dangerously, perhaps seemingly unconsciously, because it is normative, that emerge from an established place to maintain and keep that power in place. And we need to be cognizant that even as we seek to displace one site of power, there are other sites of power that still remain. So methodology is political. We must recognize it, confront it, and deploy it to the benefit of our project, Anglo-Indian Studies. But always there are cautionary notes for both insiders and outsiders. Recently writing about the British rapper Mathangi Maya Arul Pragasam of Sri Lankan Tamil origin, whose stage name is MIA, in her piece, MIA and the Defense of Nuance, Faria Royson wrote, accessibility to political language is a certain kind of privilege, which then requires responsibility. We need methodologies that take on power, challenge, and turn topsy-turvy established hegemonies, methodologies that are subversive, that disrupt, and that interrupt. We must read against the grain. Anglo-Indian studies is to a large extent about challenging and turning on their heads established hegemonies. Therefore, well-established or other emergent methodologies of subversion that bring from the margins to the center provide us with many tools. In Ideology, Terry Eagleton wrote, it is not enough for a woman or colonial subject to be defined as a lower form of life. They must be actively taught this definition, and some of them prove to be brilliant graduates in this process. It is astonishing how subtle, resourceful, and quick-witted men and women can be in proving themselves to be uncivilized and thick-headed. A dominant power may legitimate itself by promoting beliefs and values congenial to it, naturalizing and universalizing such beliefs so as to render them self-evident and apparently inevitable, denigrating ideas which might challenge it. Overturning the likes of this is what we are up against. How are methodology and theory connected? Theories emerge in specific historical contexts and are embedded in economic, political, social, cultural, institution, and intellectual processes. In my own work, I've applied several methodologies to great effect with tropes especially of gender and nationalism, feminist, subaltern, and Saidian. namely Said's critique of Orientalism. Historically, we have seen how feminist research methods challenge traditional research in the social sciences and elsewhere, traditional research that is used as a tool for promoting sexist ideology and that ignores issues of concern to women and feminists. Feminist methodologies get us to decolonize ourselves from the hegemony of patriarchy. They clarify for us how female sexuality and notions of honor and shame have been conceptualized and manipulated to ensure and protect the dominance of patriarchal power and privilege. These methodologies also reveal how notions of space, real and imagined, in terms of private and public spheres, have been constructed to maintain patriarchal privilege or to disempower women. And even as we arrive at this clarity, we see, because we are critical, we see resistances, we see agency exerted within the constraints of patriarchy. Feminist method thus has been most useful in uncovering the manner in which Anglo-Indians have been represented by others, and feminist method has brought clarity to why Anglo-Indian insiders have often instinctively arched our backs defensively in rejection of ubiquitous caricaturing and stereotyping. Feminist methodology is activism, so there is no option. Similarly, with Anglo-Indian studies, it cannot but be an activist methodology. It has to be applied and energetic because it is taking on established power figuratively and literally. Many years ago, Gerda Lerner, a pioneer in feminist women's history, wrote about two trends that were visible in the field of women's history in the early days. One was compensatory history, or the writing of history of women worthies, women of achievement, and what did they achieve. And the other was contribution history, women's contribution to, or their status in, and their oppression by male-defined society. Some of the earliest writing about Anglo-Indians by insiders, and this trend continues today, is what could be described similarly as compensatory and contributory. How Anglo-Indian worthies have achieved, made good, and in so doing have put the lie to the stereotype. However, but drawing attention to the proverbial exception to the rule, and might this kind of work have actually had the opposite effect to the one intended? Might it have fed into stereotypical categorizations? So my contention is that while compensatory history and contribution history are understandable and have merit, it is also important to document, to record, and to celebrate in context, objectively and unashamedly, warts and all, as for example, Alan Seeley does in his literary masterpiece, Trottanama, an in-your-face paean to Anglo-Indians and Anglo-India. And as I attempted to do many years ago in my article, In Search of Kathleen McNally and Other Chimerical Women. From my understanding, much of the reactionary anger and defensiveness that leads to compensatory attempts eventually, inadvertently, and unintentionally support a status quo that makes Anglo-Indians outsiders and marginal by shouting too loudly how good we are, how competent we are, what patriots we are. We are actually saying that the stereotype is the reality. And hey, look, there are exceptions, and why don't we just concentrate on these exceptions? In so doing, we're reinforcing stereotypes about lascivious women and indigent men, or that Anglo-Indians are about brawn but not brain, good in sports but not in studies, etc. What we need to do, as had been done in women's studies, is let Anglo-Indians speak for themselves. My name is Suzette Jordan, proclaimed Suzette Jordan, who rejected the euphemism Anglo-Indian rape victim. We need work on Anglo-Indians more holistically and inclusively. We need to put Anglo-Indians in the wider context of colonialism, nationalism, and casteism, because even though Anglo-Indians do not recognize caste, the lived context is one where purity and pollution, as inscribed in Suvarna or dominant caste ideology, is omnipresent. To paraphrase the late feminist scholar activist of caste, Sharmila Rege, talking about similar approaches to Dalit studies, we should guard against and avoid simple additives, just sprinkling Anglo-Indians into some pre-existing mix and then stirring with expectations of change while we leave philosophies and structures unchallenged. In the service of time, I will briefly run through some of the other methodologies that I've mentioned and that I've used to great effect, and there is overlap amongst them all. Subaltern studies methodologies facilitate clear recognition of power inequalities. Subaltern studies draws attention to the role of ideology and hegemony to create and perpetuate inequalities. Subaltern methodology also makes you recenter the subject and locate the subaltern as the focus. It makes legitimate the subaltern, the voice, the actions, the life of the subaltern become invisible in their own right, not mediated through elites. Subaltern methodology also contributes to an appreciation of subversion and recognition of resistances in their many manifestations. You can see why subaltern methodology can be so apt and fruitful for Anglo-Indian studies. Saidian post-colonial methodology, especially that elaborated in his book Orientalism, makes very clear the nexus between power and knowledge. Those who hold power can also construct knowledge that immediately becomes legitimate because they hold power and get to determine and decide what is important and what is legitimate and illegitimate. Orientalism also explains how knowledge constructed out of power differentials work to replicate, legitimate, and perpetuate power inequalities. Said elaborates on how othering, emanating from unequal power equations of colonialism, construct the other as timeless, essentialized, unchanging, backward, and so on. The manufacturing of the trope of the unchanging, essentialized Anglo-Indian becomes very comprehensible. What I have found very useful for my work in Anglo-Indian studies is a critique of the nation and nationalism. I have found how these constructs of nation and nationalism can limit and circumscribe the existence of groups that do not conform to whatever the current iteration of the nation may be. Willy-nilly dubbing a group anti-national creates open season for discrimination, marginalization, drowning in the Mediterranean, or lynching on a rural road on the Rajasthan-Haryana border. The urge to construct identities that fit the nation may not be the most useful for Anglo-Indians if we are to be understood and appreciated on our own terms. And of course, this realization is not new and not limited to Anglo-Indians. Tagore evolves from a nationalist to a universal humanist because of his abhorrence of the consequences of nationalism, the putting up of narrow domestic walls. In her recent book, What's Wrong with Rights, Radha D'Souza makes the argument that rights has emerged from Enlightenment discourse that privileges the individual and property, but also came about in the construction of nations and national identities. So inherently, rights discourse assumed citizenship. However, if citizenship is denied or not recognized, a person becomes, as Giorgio Agamben says, a homo sacer, a person without a legal existence and therefore denied rights and protection. So what good are rights if one is denied, stripped off, or merely de-recognized from citizenship? And current echoes, even as we meet, are there concerning the NCR in Assam. Hence, the limitations of rights and the limitations of claims to rights emanating from national identities. The moral of the tale is, if you don't belong, you don't have rights, you don't have a legal existence, you do not exist, you are invisibilized. In his recent work, Secularism and the Crisis of Minority Identity in Post-Colonial Literature, the Anglo-Indian scholar Roger McNamara writes, to dismiss the voices of these Anglo-Indians, Burghers, Parsis, communities, because they happen to be minuscule, reproduces the logic of nation-states that refuse the rights of larger minorities because they are still numerically fewer. Apart from methodologies that I've used, increasingly I'm aware that Anglo-Indian studies would do well to adapt from existing methodologies that are spoken to other historically disempowered groups, from Black studies and its corollary, critical race studies, from Dalit studies, and from indigenous studies. They have all developed and are developing significant tools and methods that we can look at and use. I will move swiftly here in order to elaborate what I mean while also cognizant of the time I have. In this regard, Dalit studies scholars have also taken a lot from Black studies, and generally Dalit scholars acknowledge the watershed moment and momentum that was gained in Dalit studies after the UN Conference on Racism in Durban in 2002, when Dalits told the world that casteism is racism. While it would be ahistorical and ethically and morally problematic to equate casteism with the discrimination and methodologically problematic representation of Anglo-Indians, we can still find some parallels that are very prescient, and I would urge that we try to develop closer scholarly networks with Dalit and critical race scholars. Definitely Anglo-Indian studies, Dalit studies, Black studies, and indigenous studies, as with other work on communities that have been marginalized, such as queer theory, is of pressing urgency. As we have seen with feminist and women's studies, what happens in the academy can inform and contribute to work on the ground and to the lived realities of communities that experience marginalization and discrimination. Critical race theory owes its origins to critical theory being combined with the Black experience, and critical theory itself is about a critique of society and culture brought about by applying knowledge from the social science and the humanities, and particularly the disciplines of sociology and literary criticism. Critical theory came to describe the making of theory by engaging in critique. Critical race theory points out that race is not biological, but that it is socially constructed. As such, race reinforces power inequalities and maintains elite white interests. Critical race theory looks at society and culture as it relates to categories of race, of law, and of power. This construction, which impacts work, laws, economics, and politics, leads to disproportional disadvantage experienced by Black and minority communities, who might then get categorized as primordially lacking, incapable of, less intelligent, or of criminal bent, indigent, highly sexualized. You can see how critical race theory speaks so powerfully to Anglo-Indians as represented in popular works, literary, filmic, but also in more serious scholarship. First of all, race theory shows how white supremacy and racial inequality are maintained over time, often with the force of law, which legitimates the established status quo. Then critical theory looks at how this problematic relationship between the law and racial power can be transformed. It has since moved into other disciplines. Critical race theory also broke with a tradition of largely Western white thinkers and critics and foregrounded in the USA, Martin Luther King Jr., W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, Angela Davis, and Frantz Fanon. Just like the women's movement, and I realize that it is not a homogeneous movement, but I'm using this as a shorthand. Just as the women's movement generated feminist theory, so the Black movement has generated critical race theory and continues on today with Black Lives Matter. On the other side of the Atlantic and the Caribbean, we have the contributions to this theory by C.L.R. James, A. Sivanandan, and Stuart Hall, as well here also Frantz Fanon. Perhaps one of the best-known exponents today of critical race theory is Kimberly Crenshaw, whose essay Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. This article generated what has come to be known as the theory of intersectionality, which demonstrates that race worked to problematize the lives of Black people and people of color in all dimensions and domains in many ways. When you read, understand, and grasp critical race theory, like other theories that challenge entrenched power, feminist theory, for example, it makes such great sense for us in Anglo-Indian studies. It is common sense. Indigenous studies, especially in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Canada, USA, and Australia, has front and center challenged colonialism, settler colonialism, and racism. Again, we encounter theory that has a dialogical relationship with activism emanating from lived experience. This is what I call living theory and theory that challenges, demands, that turns givens topsy-turvy. One of the best-known scholars of Indigenous studies, Linda Tui Smith from Aotearoa, New Zealand, in her classic work, Decolonizing Methodologies, writes, "Decolonization is concerned with having a more critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values that inform research practices." In her book, Tui Smith applies feminist theory and critical theory to take apart Western research and critically demonstrates that what is presented as objectivity is not. And Mary Baptiste, the Mi'kmaq scholar activist in Canada, who says, "Nothing about us without us." Dalit studies is a form of academic, as well as social, political, cultural, and economic discourse that looks for the voice of the marginalized and speaks for them, but more importantly, with them. Just over a decade ago, in preparation for possibly the first conference on Dalit studies in India, held at Madras Institute of Development Studies in 2007, the concept paper introduced the need for a systematic understanding of the diverse aspects of Dalit people's knowledge, experience, and learning as well as unlearning. In my estimation, this is very prescient for Anglo-Indian studies too. The concept paper also made links with race and caste that was articulated in Durban in 2002 and demonstrated parallels with critical race theory in order to construct theory, methodology, and pedagogy for Dalit studies. It called for a separate discipline or a category within disciplines and pointed out the usefulness for inter, trans, multidisciplinary approaches, that Dalit should be both concept and category. It saw Dalit studies as a way to bridge theory and practice. As a result of the demographic of Dalits, clearly there can never be identical issues and experiences with Anglo-Indian studies, but these are parallels and we can learn. As Satyanarayana stated, two purposes that Dalit studies may serve: one, finding an alternative way to produce knowledge, which involves research, and the other is finding alternative pedagogic practices. However, Anglo-Indian studies are not Dalit studies. Dalit studies are about structural change. The closest Anglo-Indian studies comes to Dalit studies is about systemic change. And in areas where casteism and racism overlap, that's where Anglo-Indian studies also shares similarities. The objectification and denigration of Anglo-Indians does have shades of racism. One of the big questions for Anglo-Indian studies is who speaks for whom? What concerns and distinctions do we have for insider, outsider, out of time? And as Spivak famously wrote, can the subaltern speak? Well, you can probably guess what my responses to these questions would be. Definitely Anglo-Indians need to be involved, but non-Anglo-Indians are also very, very important. I'm just going to sort of now cut down over here. So Anglo-Indians need to be involved, but we can't put the entire burden on Anglo-Indians. Moreover, we cannot presume that all Anglo-Indians would be interested in Anglo-Indian studies. I remember now with a twinge of regret how Anglo-Indians at the Bangalore reunion in 1998 chased us off the stage when we were making our presentations at the symposium. I don't quite know what they expected, clearly not the delivery of papers, especially those like mine that mistakenly in the eyes of some was perhaps reinforcing stereotypes, which I was not, but perhaps the nuance didn't get picked up. But they didn't want to hear research and they didn't want to hear negative things. Okay? I was going to say something about the use of new concepts like stigma. I'm also going to cut very quickly. I was going to speak about outsider-insider relationships and the importance of genuine allyship and what is often known as accomplishship. And we can't put all outsiders in the same boat. And we see similar discussions happening in Black studies and Dalit studies. We know scholars who are close and manifest an empathy and are sympathetic to community concerns, even as they go about research, applying their disciplinary methods with integrity, and they must continue to be part of Anglo-Indian studies. These discussions are ongoing, very fraught. Recently in Canada, 2 shows were pulled. One was a show about enslaved people. The other was about indigenous history because of the concerns that Black people were not involved and indigenous people were not involved. And it's raised a whole lot of debate about artistic freedom and so on. But in the debate, there was a response by a white musicologist that I feel, I'm just going to read this very quickly. When she was asked, as a white woman in a predominantly Black field of study, how do these discussions affect your work? Her name is Ingrid Monson, and she said, you need to work very closely with African-American performers and communities that are represented. I think there are different points in history when I would argue that the racial walls go up and the racial walls go down. Right now in the United States, I would say that the racial walls are up and African-Americans do not trust white Americans. And why should they? And so I think the possibility of mounting that kind of production of representations of African Americans without the participation of African Americans is very problematic. But she says it's not impossible to have these kinds of collaborations at a less tense time. But most importantly, people build on the personal relationships they have with different kinds of people. And if an artist feels comfortable with a white performer, they'll include the white performer. So allyship and accomplishship is about building relationships. It's not about knee-jerk exclusion of outsiders, but a recognition of those who have given time and built relationships with the people who they are seeking to represent. There's a whole section recently in a discussion about caste in Hindi and Bollywood films, which I'm just not going to get into. And just finally, to conclude, it's a good time for us to collectively pool the tools we have been using and developing and produce bespoke methodology for Anglo-Indian studies. Definitely, we will build on what has been used successfully in other domains and to bring into relief in human ways what has worked. We need to develop Anglo-Indian critical theory and epistemological frameworks for Anglo-Indian studies and provide counter-hegemonic tools, lenses that bring out Anglo-Indian specificities. All the time, keeping in mind that more than speaking for, we need to speak with. Authenticity is crucial, and we need to also always keep in mind what the impact will be for Anglo-Indians today in our lived reality. For today, I've tried by outlining what I have done, what scholars working on other marginalized groups have emphasized to show us some ways forward. Thank you so much.